Today I'm feeling nostalgic, so we're going to revisit an old subject. The very first video I ever did on the Underground was on the subject of the deep-level air raid shelters hiding in plain sight on the London Underground. Don't bother watching it, it's not very good. But today I thought I'd take a closer look at one of those shelters and the station it's attached to. We're going back to Clapham South. So, Clapham South Station was opened on the 13th of September 1926. Today it's on the Northern Line, but back then it was part of the City and South London Railway. Until 1926, the line that I'm going to call the Northern Line for convenience only went as far south as Clapham Common. In 1913, the City and South London Railway had been bought out by Underground Electric Railways of London. UERL was nicknamed the Combine and was fiercely acquisitive. They already owned another line called the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway, and once they had the City and South London, they got to work on combining the two into a single line. At the same time, they upgraded the City and South London, which had been overtaken by technology. With this work underway, they could contemplate expansion. UERL was backed by American money provided by the ruthless Chicago businessman Charles Yerkes. American money came with American know-how on how to provide rapid, efficient transport. It also came with an American approach to building railways. In Britain, the normal way was to build a railway from somewhere to somewhere. Yerkes wanted lines from the city to the middle of nowhere. His argument was that the presence of a good public transport link would drive development and create new suburbs. And he was right. The Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway originally terminated at Golders Green, which at the time was all fields, and now looks like this. Yerkes himself was long gone by the time the Combine acquired the City and South London, but the policy remained in place. This time they wanted to extend south into the then largely rural district of Morden. Clapham South was the first station on this extension. One of the most important things to note about Clapham South is its architecture. Normally, when a station was built in a rural area, it was designed to blend in with its surroundings. You can see this elsewhere on the Underground. Charles Holden was the architect commissioned to design the stations on the Morden extension, and he was having none of that. The stations on the Morden extension were big, airy, and faced in Portland stone, a material that Holden explicitly associated with the City of London. The word iconic is overused, especially when it comes to buildings, but that is what Holden was going for. Stations that would stand out and act as a focal point for the new suburbs growing up around them. Each one would be built to fit the requirements of their site, but all would have features in common. Clapham South was, as I said, the first station built on this extension, and so it was built with a number of experimental features that weren't used elsewhere. Holden collaborated with Harold Stabler on the interior design. Stabler designed ceramic tiles which would be both decorative and hard-wearing. He originally intended a much fancier look inspired by Indian, Chinese and Iberian design. This didn't go ahead, sadly. The tops of the columns here are relics of that fancier look. There's quite a bit of wrought iron, more elaborate than you get elsewhere on this extension. Uplighters are a common feature on the escalators of the Underground, but at Clapham South, the ceiling of the escalator was originally stepped. It was thought that this might provide better illumination, but this was found not to be so. Later stations would use a sloping ceiling, and Clapham South's escalator passage was rebuilt not long after opening. Clapham Common and Clapham North both have island platforms, not so at Clapham South. The platforms are built in separate tunnels to allow greater capacity, which the company were confident they would need. It's not really relevant to the architecture, but in the early days the station might have been called Balham North or Nightingale Lane. In fact, roundels bearing the name Nightingale Lane were installed, and when London Transport changed their minds, Clapham South plates were fixed over the top. The Morden extension was a success. In many ways it was a victim of its own success. Within a couple of decades it was massively overcrowded, as was the whole line into central London. In 1933 the line became part of London Transport, and they had plans to extend the Northern Line further into the northern suburbs. So it was clear that the problem would only get worse if action wasn't taken. The idea they favoured was a new tube line running under or around the existing one. In the late 1930s, the government were more worried about international developments. It seemed very likely that the world was once again heading for war. And the question was asked of what should be done about sheltering the populace against air raids, not least by the populace themselves. In 1940, the Blitz began, an intensive campaign of German air raids. The need for shelter became extremely acute. The idea of sheltering on the underground was nothing new. People had taken refuge there during the First World War, and they would do the same during the Second, despite initial official attempts to discourage this. So when the need arose for new air raid shelters, the underground was an obvious starting point. Many stations had been built with lifts that had been replaced with escalators, so the original idea was to use the disused shafts as a starting point, and build outwards from there at the bottom. But this was dismissed as impractical, so the government revisited London Transport's requests for new tube lines. A scheme was devised. London Transport were to build deep-level shelters along the northern and central lines, because who knew better about digging tunnels? Then, at some unspecified point in the future, these could be connected up to form the new lines. The sites selected were Belsize Park, Camden Town, Goodge Street, Oval, Stockwell, Clapham North, Clapham Common and Clapham South on the Northern Line, and Chancery Lane, St Paul's and a point halfway between Liverpool Street and Bethnal Green on the Central Line. Oval and Liverpool Street/Bethnal Green were abandoned early on due to labour shortages, and the cathedral authorities objected to St Paul's, so that got pulled as well. In 1940 construction began, and in 1942 they were completed. The surface buildings are very basic, as you would expect under the circumstances. In 1940, Balham had been bombed and flooded, resulting in at least 66 deaths, so these buildings were intended to provide some shielding in the event of a hit. However, by this time the most intensive period of bombing was over, so they weren't used for their intended purpose at first. Some were used for official purposes. Soldiers were accommodated at Camden Town, Chancery Lane, Clapham Common, Stockwell and our friend Clapham South. Firefighters were housed at Clapham North. Goodge Street became General Eisenhower's London headquarters. In 1944 they were finally open to the public. They were very well equipped as shelters go, featuring sanitation facilities, canteens, dormitories and medical posts. Each one had a committee to administer things and keep the peace. And there was a PA system that could play announcements and music. The shelters were divided into named sections that were themed after famous British people. Those at Clapham South were named after naval heroes. At Belsize Park, explorers. Camden Town, generals. Chancery Lane, political leaders. Clapham Common, engineers. Clapham North, writers. Stockwell, architects. And Goodge Street, scientists. As we now know, 1944 was relatively late in the war. Despite the introduction of the fearsome V-weapons that brought new terror to air raids, the shelters didn't see the kind of use that their builders expected. Belsize Park, Clapham North and Goodge Street were actually closed due to low demand. The rest went, of course, in 1945. There's some debate as to what was actually supposed to happen vis-à-vis the conversion of the shelters into stations, and I've read conflicting accounts. One book I consulted for this suggested that the shelter locations couldn't be used as stations because the tunnels are too narrow. I read another article, and I'm afraid I can't remember exactly where, that says that no, these definitely were the locations. I am absolutely capable of making mistakes, so take all of this with a pinch of salt. What I will point out is that there is access from the platforms at Clapham South to the deep shelter, which may back the latter theory up. What I do know is that while the war was raging, the plan was being worked on. A think tank, known as the Railway London Plan Committee, was considering new railway and underground lines for London, and they published their report in 1946. Congestion on the Northern Line was considered a pressing issue. The northern part was kind of in flux. They decided they didn't want to duplicate the Northern Line there. But in the south they wanted to do just that, with a line from Kennington to Tooting Broadway. This didn't get built, because there was no money to build it with. The deep shelter at Clapham South never became a station, but it did find other uses. In 1948, the Empire Windrush brought a wave of immigrants from the West Indies looking to start a new life in Britain, viewed as the mother country at the time. There were labour shortages, particularly in the new National Health Service, on the new British railways and on London transport. 200 of the immigrants were temporarily housed in Clapham South. Employment offices were set up in the shelter. But there was also a labour exchange in nearby Brixton. As a result, many of the new arrivals settled in Brixton. 1951 brought the Festival of Britain, a massive celebration of Britain designed to improve morale in the depressed post-war years. Of course, this brought a massive influx of people to make it all happen, and many of them were also housed at Clapham South. And after that, well, it became archives, which is something of an anticlimax. But the story has a happy ending. When flats were built on top of the entrance, it was no longer possible for vans and lorries to access it. The shelter was Grade 2 listed because, despite now being useless, it was very well preserved. It has since undergone some restoration and now can be toured as part of the Hidden London programme. I recommend it, if you don't mind stairs. I hope you enjoyed this well-armoured tale from the tube. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. As I said at the beginning, this is something of a remake. I don't normally do that, but since making the original I've got more footage and I've learned a lot more, so much so that I thought a new video was justified. I don't want to remake all my videos because I think that would be very boring for long-time subscribers, so it's something I'd only want to do if there really is enough to make it worth your while. Let me know your thoughts on that in the comment section. I'd also be interested to know your thoughts on the speculative tube line, because I just find that kind of thing really fascinating. Anyway, I would like to thank my supporters on Ko-fi and Patreon for their generous donations. You are the concrete to my shelter. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.